Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have your Rockstar or Monster out, because today we're going to be talking about the recent news of the C8 Corvette ZR1 that has just been spotted earlier this month, and the full unveiling what happened literally just the other day. And I kind of saw this in the news cycle, so I may be a little late, but I was hoping that I could make a video and kind of go through some technicalities. So this is a picture of it that we got last month. Notice the Michigan manufacturing plates. Those M plates are very rare and only used by the manufacturers. And this beautiful camo, obviously this is to kind of hide what the car would look like. These are kind of crappy nowadays. Now we have better camo types, but it seems as though GM didn't really care for that. And it looks as though the biggest portion of this car will be the actual engine. So a lot of people have been speculating throughout the years, like what would be the engine in the ZR1 this time. When the Corvette just came out, the speculation was that it would take an LT2 and they would just basically slap some turbos on it. When the Z06 came out with the DOHC shenanigans that they were going on with that allowed them to make so much more power, then we thought the LT6 was the way to go. And now it seems to be apparent that they were going to use a twin turbo LT6 engine, which we have speculated to be called the LT7. So this would be a 5.5 liter V8 DOHC that would strap two turbos on it, making 850 horsepower and about 750 pound-feet of torque. Now, for the spec guys that are kind of keeping this in check, you would notice that this is not the speculation we had a couple months ago when we were saying that it would be a twin charge setup. Now, why we had pretty good idea that it might be a twin charge setup is because on the regular LT6, we used basically a RAM charger manifold that allowed us to create a kind of a variable intake manifold, and would allow for a higher peak horsepower. It was giving out higher pressure than it was going in, which is what a RAM manifold usually is used for. So that was a pretty interesting setup and allowed for the Corvette Z06 to have more torque down low and better peak horsepower. But of course that wouldn't work when you're running forced induction into it. So the supercharger would replace the manifold and be used inside the engine. Now obviously this news was again speculative in nature, and so now we're realizing that it is likely going to be a twin turbo setup. And there's a couple of reasons why you would want to go with a twin turbo setup. For one, running that twin charger would be a manufacturing nightmare. For two, running a supercharger that is getting forced injection from turbos has historically been very hard to do, while also being able to cool down that supercharger. So unless you want to go with like a Hennessy setup where you're running a bunch of basically chilled water into the system, basically having a freezer in the back of your car, otherwise it just doesn't really work. Now would I suggest that for a what's supposed to be a track car? Obviously not. So the twin turbo just made a lot of sense on paper, and also like if you think about it through the design of the car. Now 850 horsepower doesn't seem like a lot compared to the Z06, which had already 700 horsepower. That was quite a big number for a track ready sub 50 grand, or sorry, sub 70 grand track car. But the real story is going to be the twin turbocharger's throttle response, which has always been a problem with twin turbos. And also it doesn't necessarily, like, the horsepower is not necessarily a good figure to consider like track times. So a good example of that is the old history with the Corvette ZR1 and the Dodge Viper. So let's get into that real quick. One of the reasons why the ZR1 nameplate was even released was that Chevy was starting to play with the supercars with the Z06, and they realized that they wanted to build something that would absolutely destroy the Nurburgring and kill off most of its competition. At the time, the competition was Nissan, Porsche for some at some level, but mostly it was at the time Lamborghini was really killing it on the Nur, and there were also, again, Nissan was a really big competitor, as well as like Radicals and things like that. But when the ZR1 came out right at the beginning, it had a 600 horsepower LS9, which is an excellent engine, very good power plant, but it was killed off by the Dodge Viper, the 5th gen Dodge Viper right here. And this was in 2008, so it was right after the ZR1 came out. Absolutely embarrassed the ZR1 owners that were buying these cars, but at the same time had a lot less horsepower. The ACR had only about 570 or 550 horsepower, which is only a little bit more than the Z06. And of course, we all know that the Corvette had about like 650 horsepower if you looked at the dyno numbers, but obviously on paper had about 640 horsepower. So that was very frustrating to ZR1 owners. The story continued when they came out with the C7. Now, during this kind of cycle, there was, Chevy got more and more involved with the Nurburgring tuning and so on and so forth, whereas Dodge had already set up that kind of racing pedigree because they were competing at the time in European racing, if you guys didn't know about that, with the GTSR or whatever that one's called. But the Chevy really got into it. They built the Z28, which was an LS7 based Camaro, and then they also waited a couple years for Dodge to respond to kind of those generation of cars, and they ended up with the C7 ZR1. Now the C7 ZR1 was chasing after the last gen ACR, which was no longer called the ACR Extreme, just called the ACR, and the ACR was giving a sub 7-minute lap on the Nurburgring, which is really crazy. And so GM decided to slap a really big wing on the back of the chassis of a C7 and obviously a Z06, and put on a big ass supercharger, a bigger supercharger than even the Z06, and try to demolish Viper at its own game. That ended up being not very successful. Came out right at the end of the Viper's life cycle. Basically, Dodge just threw in the towel, said we can't sell this car anymore, and the C7 ZR1 ended up not beating the Viper on many lap records, but also just people that bought the Vipers were able to give in a better lap than the official ZR1 lap. So that was pretty embarrassing for the C7. So with this model, we see it running on the Nürburgring. We assume that this is Corvette trying to, that last hurrah as a Nürburgring killer. And so we had to look at some of its competition to understand better the story here. So at the moment, the fastest lapped car, or manufactured car, I should say, on the Nürburgring is the AMG 1, and this is the new supercar based off of the F1 pedigree of Mercedes. And obviously it's coming out a little late because in Formula 1 Mercedes is getting absolutely pwned by Red Bull, but it's making just around 1,000 horsepower, which is a little too much compared to what the Corvette is doing. But in second place here, we have a 992 GT2. Now, this is the previous gen 992, so this is a 991.2. Sorry, did I say 992? My bad, 911. You see, it's all numbers, 1, 2, 1, 2. So 911 GT2, this is a 991.2 generation RS Menthe Racing. This thing did a sub 640. So that would probably be the lap to beat. It's a twin turbocharged flat six, making 700 horsepower around about. I think it's making a little bit more at the top end with the Menthe Racing setup, but that doesn't really matter, I guess. The AMG GT Black Series, which is really just the evolution of a Viper. I mean, it's multiple generations over a Viper, but it's based off of a similar or coherent chassis that's going on here. I believe it's the same rigidity as the SLS, so I assume it's similar chassis here, and that one's doing just under a 645 at 730 horsepower. So I think this would be the one to beat. Obviously, the 911s are also a pretty good place to beat them. I mean, look at this GT3 RS. This is non-turbo, 500 horsepower, under 645 laps. So I think if the Corvette C8 ZR1 gave a sub 645 lap, we would be at a very good place. We're beating the Huracans, we're beating all that stuff. But also, in the showrooms, the C8 ZR1 still has to beat a couple of things on the radar here. let's go back to the picture here. So some things that are really noticeable is obviously this much bigger GT3 style wing. Actually, this wing reminds me more of the Le Mans racing wings, which are curved naturally, and this allows for a better flow, both in the front and in the back. It also allows for less overall, less overall downforce at a higher top speed, whereas there's more downforce at kind of a medium speed, which is kind of what you want for a supercar nowadays. It does seem to be adaptable, so you can change the modes, which is really cool. And it seems as though it is much thicker than last time with the C701, which seemed to be pretty like unsolid. It kind of looked like they just slapped on a wing, but in this case, it seems as though they're using a lot more downforce, and so they need a lot more rigidity on those on the chassis. So that's very good news, I think. Another thing to notice, however, is these really nice, multi-spoke wheels. These are kind of like star formed. They're very beautiful. However, from my knowledge of carbon fiber and building carbon fiber rims, I believe these are non-carbon fiber rims. Some pictures have depicted it with the Z06 rims. That's totally possible, those beautiful carbon fiber rims. But I think that out the factory, they're not going to sell the carbon fiber rims because, firstly, we do have problems with them when it comes to like high laps and hitting certain bumps, especially at high speed. And secondly, I believe that using a magnesium and graphite alloy, you can come to kind of the same weight, whereas you have none of that fractionability that carbon fiber could have. So that's not to say that they can't give you like premium wheels, but obviously I don't think it would be necessary to have those kinds of wheels. Another thing you'll notice is this extra scoop that's happening right here. So with the C8, we had this weird shark fin that was happening here beside the door. And this was always kind of controversial from the get-go. Like the design, it just didn't really look natural. It kind of looked weird at certain angles. And also, it was a necessary evil because there was not much cooling happening in the front, I should say the frunk of the car, the front trunk, and so it's kind of necessary because we wanted that frunk, but at the same time we wanted to cool the LT2. So it was really necessary to have those fins, although they looked really ugly. But in this car, it looks as though the turbo intercoolers, which are traditionally done in the front of the car or in the side of the car. Obviously that's kind of difficult with the C8 platform where the side of the car cools the LT2, so you'd have to have really big cooling system going all the way to the front. If you know anything about turbo cooling, it has to be really, really close to those turbos. That's the best way you could do it. Otherwise, you could have some cooling difficulties, and especially like long term. I mean, you're talking about a lot of cooling that is expected to go to those turbos. It's a lot of piping, let's say. Subaru guys know what I'm talking about here. But it looks as though we have this extra scoop here that would be used for the turbos. So that's really good news. They would probably add an extra intercooler. But this also kind of validates what I was saying earlier about the turbos. It looks as though they're going to be using pretty small turbos for the setup, and that would allow for better throttle response. Obviously, you won't get the peak horsepower that you would expect with a ZR1. Usually the ZR1s are crazy, they're making way much more power than everything else, but I don't think it's necessary this generation, and I'll go through why that is. So the last couple years, the C6 ZR1 was competing with the Huracan. Sorry, not the Huracan, the Gallardo, the Murcielago, which made kind of the same power at certain trims, the Viper, which was always making a little bit less power, but you could tune it up for more power. Obviously, it was much harder than the C6s, but it's kind of similar. It was also competing in its own range with the Z06 because it was only making a little bit more power than the Z06 in theoretical or dyno terms, I should say. And it was competing with a bunch of other exotic cars that were just not quite there. I could think of one, which is the McLaren 12C, which was a little later in the C6's generation. But again, they were competing back to back, 600 horsepower. The C7 had a lot more of its job already done. The Huracan Performante, which was not making that much more horsepower. I didn't even mention Ferrari. I should have mentioned that at first. Ferrari making 600 horsepower in 2009, which was similar to the ZR1, but obviously the ZR1 had a lot more torque, so it was just beating it off the line and in top speed. And then later on, we got the forced induction, so the 488 and the F8, which is kind of the generation of the C7. C7 was just making a lot more power and making it a higher power band, so this thing was just killing Ferraris, Lamborghinis, no problem. Absolute supercar killer, if you think about it. I mean, this is what the Viper should have been, which was kind of a slap onto the Viper a little bit. But now the work is a little cut to the C8s, you know, making more than 600 or 700 horsepower has become kind of a chore now that we live in this kind of emissions friendly era where, you know, cars no longer are not allowed to be their purest version. So here we have the 296 GTB, which on paper is making more power overall. It's making about 830 horsepower. Now, if the C8 is making 850 horsepower, now it's, you know, that's a little, you know, it's a little bit more, but I don't think it would be a lot more. And with those hybrid motors, we're talking about a lot more pound-feet off the line. Now, the big difference is that obviously with this pure powertrain, you're going to be having that 850 horsepower on tap at all times, whereas with a 296, it's just an absolute disaster when it comes to that stuff. A lot of people have mentioned that it's not great to drive. It's more of a tail-happy car to drive. It's not really a pure race car to drive. Now, they've tried a couple of things, you know, the 296 Challenge, for instance, which just takes out the hybrid system, you know, out of the gate. But, yeah, I think on this standpoint, the C8 is going to be just better value overall. Then we have the Lamborghinis. So Lamborghini is not allowed to sell the Huracan anymore, which was their best seller. Like, they sold so many of those. It really, like, they flew by the factory. And they're not allowed to sell those anymore because of emissions regulation in Europe and in California. And so they're kind of going back to their early designs. It kind of has that Gallardo look, in my opinion. And this thing is going to have a twin-turbo V8, so very similar to the Corvette, although this one I believe is going to be the Audi powertrain, the one they've been using since the S6, the C9 generation or so on, which is also found in like the Q8, the RS Q8 and so on and so forth. And it's going to be a hybrid powertrain. Now this thing is going to make a lot less power because it is going to be a twin turbocharged V8 with that kind of plug-in hybrid system. There's not much to say about it other than, you know, I think the work is going to be cut out for the Corvette. Although, I mean, that Lamborghini on the side, I mean, that looks really good. But the C8 is likely going to kill it on the Nurburgring. Lamborghini hasn't been competitive on the Nurburgring for quite some time, ever since the SVJ, which is already kind of a big fat pig. But we're going to end up with some pretty interesting results. I think the C8 will have to beat the Black Series at the very least, which is probably going to be a easy feat, given that the C8 chassis could put very large tires in the back. We saw that with the Z06, the twin turbo setup, which is kind of tuned up. Like, really, the whole chassis for the Corvette is tuned up to make sure that the 0 to 60 and the 0 to 100 is as fast as possible. And with the Z06 making 700 horsepower, we kind of seen it happen. You know, it did a sub 10-second quarter mile. And it's a track weapon, right? This is not something you can say about the GT Black Series, which is, you know, in the upwards of 10 seconds, and it's, you know, it's got that twin turbocharged system. Very, very strange times we live in now, you know, with those NA beating twin turbo setups. It's almost as if people have used twin turbos as truck crutches, and now we're kind of going in that generation where, you know, the NA cars are going to have twin turbos. Pretty crazy, in my opinion. I think that overall, this thing is going to be an absolute beast. It's going to be that last hurrah for Americans in general. You know, we no longer have the Viper. This thing was crazy. And, you know, it is going to, I think it's going to write that letter, that beautiful love letter to the Nurburgring that the first ZR1 and the second one was trying to accomplish. So it's probably, on many facets, it's probably going to destroy a lot of stuff. Including, for one, your pocket. I think a lot of people are going to want this thing over even a Z06. I don't know how much more it's going to be. Obviously, that was always a problem with the ZR1s. There were more like collectible items. I know that the C7 was just a terrible mess for buying one. And many, many, many years later, there's still like 300 grand more than a basic Huracan, even though they're competing technically. But you know, if you do not care about the power or you want to do it yourself, you can always get a Z51 C8, you know, with, you know, a tiny wing, but again, you got everything you need to make yourself a big power, you know, 800 horsepower ZR1. But if you want a track weapon, if you need a track weapon for your team, I think this is going to be the one. I'm not sure what SCCA class this thing would be in, but I'm sure whatever you're going to compete against, this is going to win. There's not really much to say else. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a great day.